My name is Sarah. The day my father was laid into the ground, I expected silence, prayer, maybe even love. Instead, I stood in the church hall and heard my own family cut me out of his life with a single piece of paper. A new will, they called it. His house, his savings, his memories, all handed to my brother. And for me, the daughter who sat by his bed every night as he slipped away, nothing but his broken watch. It was not grief that filled me then, but the weight of betrayal, heavy as the earth they shoveled onto his coffin. Families are meant to hold you when the world collapses, but mine was the hammer that drove me into the ground. Stay with me, and you'll see how a woman who lost everything found a way to fight back. I am 33 years old, a school teacher in a small New England town. My life was not grand, nor was it tragic, at least not until the ground opened beneath my feet. I lived simply, in a rented apartment with peeling paint and thin walls that let in the winter wind. Each morning, I carried the faces of my students like a shield against the loneliness that followed me home. My father, John Wilson, a Navy veteran, was the anchor of my world. He taught me honesty, hard work, and the dignity of keeping one's word. In his last years, when illness bent his back and stole his breath, I became his caretaker. I cooked his meals, read his letters aloud when his eyes failed, and held his hand through nights that felt longer than war. And yet, while I sat vigil, my older brother Mark, once the shining sun, now a man chasing business schemes that crumbled like sand, barely appeared. My Aunt Linda, a woman with a talent for money and a hunger for more, spoke of responsibility, though she never lifted a finger to help. These were the people who stood beside me at my father's grave, smiling through tears while hiding sharpened knives behind their backs. They called it family, but what I saw was a stage where love had been traded for property, and loyalty had been pawned for cash. In their eyes, I was the quiet daughter, too soft, too obedient, too easily overlooked. And perhaps that was true, until the moment they tried to erase me. That was the day I learned even silence can break into thunder. Our town was the kind that people pass through without ever remembering its name. Rows of narrow houses, the church steeple casting its long shadow, and a diner that smelled of burnt coffee. It was not a place for glory, but for survival, and survival was all I had known. My father's house stood on the edge of Maple Street, white paint fading, shutters crooked, the porch creaking like an old soldier's bones. To most, it was just another weary house. To me, it was a covenant. Every wall carried my childhood laughter. Every scar in the wood told a story my father refused to forget. He once told me, "This house will always be yours, Sarah. A roof is more than wood. It is belonging." I believed him. While I measured my days by lesson plans and grocery bills, my brother Mark measured his by failed ventures, and debts whispered through the family. Aunt Linda, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, wore her ambition like perfume. You could smell it before she entered a room. Between them, talk of inheritance became a quiet storm gathering in corners, never spoken aloud to me, but heavy enough that I felt the air grow thick whenever I entered. I did not know then that grief would be the curtain they pulled to hide their scheme, that beneath the hymns at my father's funeral, the real prayer was for possession, not remembrance. In those weeks, I clung to the comfort of routine, teaching children to write essays, buying groceries, cooking soup in my father's kitchen, never suspecting that the ground beneath me was already cracking. In the evenings, after teaching and tending to my father's failing body, I would sit with him on the porch as dusk pressed against the windows. He spoke little then. His breath was short, his words rationed like a soldier's last rations. But his eyes, tired as they were, held steady on the house around us. "This place is yours, Sarah," he said one night, his voice thin but firm. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I took it as comfort. Only later did I understand it as a warning. Inside, the air was changing. Mark appeared more often, not with tenderness, but with restless energy, prowling through rooms he had not set foot in for years. He would tap the banister, run his fingers over the dining table, measured the walls with his eyes as though the house were a ledger waiting to be balanced. He spoke of renovations, of investments, words that landed in the air like foreign coins. Aunt Linda came too, always with her briefcase, always with that tight smile. She brought papers I was not invited to see, whispered with Mark in corners, and clucked her tongue when she looked at me, as if I were a stubborn child refusing to understand arithmetic. Their kindness toward my father was a performance, brief and shallow. A bouquet on the table, a hand on his shoulder, but their eyes never lingered on him. They lingered on the house. I began to notice pauses in conversation when I entered a room, the way my name slipped less and less from their lips. When I asked questions, I was met with vague answers. "Don't worry about it, Sarah. Grown-up matters, legal things." The words were soft, but the meaning was sharp. "Stay out. This is not for you." I told myself it was only my grief, my exhaustion playing tricks. Yet the silence between them, the sudden closings of folders, the laughter that ended when I walked in, these were not phantoms. They were roots of something growing in secret, burrowing beneath the floorboards of my father's house. And as autumn turned to winter, I felt the warmth of home thinning, as if I were already being written out, erased line by line before my father's breath had even left his body. The first snow fell early that year, thin and uncertain, melting as it touched the ground. My father was fading then, his body a shadow of the man who once carried me on his shoulders. I kept the house warm, brewed his tea, read aloud passages from the old Bible he kept by his bed. In those quiet hours, I thought the world still belonged to us. But beneath the surface, another season was stirring. Mark arrived one evening with a stranger in tow. Some man in a tailored coat, a realtor by the look of him. They spoke in hushed tones, measuring square footage as if my father were already gone. When I asked, Mark laughed it off, said the man was just a friend. But the friend's eyes lingered on the walls with a hunger I knew too well. Linda, too, grew bolder. She carried folders now, heavy with papers she never let me see. Once, I caught a glimpse of my father's name typed neatly across the top. When I asked, she snapped the folder shut and smiled. "It's all under control, Sarah. You just keep looking after him." There were nights when I heard them downstairs, voices rising and falling like a storm rolling in. My name floated up once, sharp, clipped, followed by silence. I told myself not to imagine, not to believe the worst. But something in the air had shifted. The house no longer felt like mine. It felt like a stage. And I, the only one who hadn't read the script. One evening, as I tucked my father beneath his quilt, he took my hand. His grip was weak, but his gaze was steady. "They'll come for this house," he whispered. "Don't let them." His words chilled me more than the wind rattling the windows. I wanted to ask who, to demand answers. But his breath faltered, and the moment slipped away. I did not know it then, but his warning was the last clear gift he gave me. The snow outside kept falling, covering the street in white. And beneath that stillness, betrayal was already taking root, waiting for the day of his funeral to bloom. The church was heavy with winter light, gray shafts breaking through stained glass, falling across bowed heads. The air smelled of lilies and damp wool coats. I sat in the front pew, hands folded tight, my father's watch clutched in my palm, its cracked face digging into my skin. I thought the day would be about him, his service, his sacrifices, his quiet dignity. But funerals, I learned, can be less about the dead and more about the living circling what remains. Mark stood tall, a performance of grief, dabbing at dry eyes. Beside him, Aunt Linda held a folder against her chest, as though it were scripture. People whispered condolences, but their eyes kept sliding toward that folder, curious, expectant. When the hymns ended and the preacher's voice faded, Linda stepped forward. Her heels struck the wooden floor like a gavel. She announced she had important words left by my father. My heart eased for a moment. I thought perhaps it was a letter of remembrance, something kind, to be shared. But then she opened the folder. Not a letter, a will, a revised will, she called it. Her voice rang through the sanctuary. The house, the savings, all assets to be transferred to Mark Wilson, the eldest son. And for me, his daughter who had read to him in his last nights, who had cooked his meals when he could no longer lift a spoon. She paused, almost savoring it. To Sarah, I leave my old watch. Laughter did not break out, but I felt it, humming beneath the silence. Some shifted in their seats, some looked away. Others studied me with pity that burned hotter than scorn. I heard blood rush in my ears. The cracked watch in my hand, the very one they claimed as my inheritance, ticked once and stopped, as if even time recoiled at the cruelty. I searched the preacher's face, the lawyer's eyes, anyone who might object, who might declare this fraud. But they looked down, folded hands tighter, lips pressed shut. No savior rose from that room. Only the sound of my brother clearing his throat, already talking about responsibilities, already smiling as if the victory were his by birthright. I sat frozen, the weight of betrayal heavier than grief. This was not my father's voice, not the man who whispered to me in his last days, "The house is yours, Sarah." No, this was the voice of ambition dressed in mourning black. And as Linda closed the folder and Mark shook hands in the aisles, I realized the funeral was not an ending. It was the unveiling of a play they had rehearsed in whispers and shadows, waiting only for my father's grave to be sealed. I was not just mourning that day. I was being erased. After the funeral, the house was full but empty all at once. People filled the rooms, coats draped over chairs, voices low, cups of coffee cooling in their hands. Yet for me, every corner echoed with silence. My father was gone, and the only thing left of him was the promise he had made, a promise that now hung in the air like smoke, already fading. Mark moved about as if he had already inherited the role of master. He clasped shoulders, accepted condolences with a nod that felt too much like ownership. Linda stood close behind him, the folder now tucked away but not forgotten. She carried herself with the satisfaction of a performance well delivered. I sat near the window, the watch still in my palm. Its face caught the winter light, fractured into lines like broken glass. People came to me with words. "He's at peace now. Your father was a good man." But their eyes slid quickly away, embarrassed by the imbalance that had just been declared. They would not speak of it, not here, not while the scent of lilies still clung to the air. Inside, I wanted to scream, to stand and shout that this was a lie, that my father's voice had been stolen. But the words died on my lips. Instead, I nodded. I thanked them. I swallowed my anger like bitter wine, because I knew the moment I protested, they would paint me, the ungrateful daughter, blinded by money, too selfish to honor her father's memory. So I endured. I carried trays of food to guests, poured coffee, even managed a weak smile when someone squeezed my shoulder. All the while, Mark laughed with his friends in the dining room, already speaking of plans for the house, while Linda whispered logistics in the hallway. I told myself, wait, let them think I am silent. Let them believe I will not fight. For now, I would bow my head, the dutiful daughter. But beneath that bow, something was hardening. The silence was not surrender. It was gathering strength. And as the last guest left and the house settled into uneasy quiet, I felt the first stirrings of resolve, faint but undeniable, like the cracking of ice before a flood. The week after the funeral, the house no longer felt like mourning. It felt like conquest. Mark returned with a ring of keys that jingled too loudly, as if announcing ownership. He walked from room to room with a swagger foreign to these walls, opening closets, dragging open drawers, muttering to himself about repairs and renovations. "This place needs a man's hand again," he said, as though my father's hand, now stilled, had never built it plank by plank. Linda followed close behind, ledger in hand, her words sharper than Mark's arrogance. "We'll need to liquidate assets quickly. The house can't sit idle. I'll have contractors by next week." I stood in the kitchen, dish towel clenched in my fist, listening as my family planned over my father's memory like scavengers circling a carcass. The kettle screamed on the stove, but no one moved to silence it. The sound was unbearable, shrill, and yet it fit the moment too well. When I reminded them gently that I still lived here, that I had taken care of this house, of him, they exchanged glances. Mark smirked. Linda's lips curved into something between pity and disdain. "Sarah," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, "you've done your part. But this is Mark's responsibility now. The will is clear. Clear. The word cut like glass. That night, I found boxes stacked against the hallway wall. Mark's handwriting scrawled across them. Attic, basement, donate. My father's belongings, his books, his Navy medals, even his worn coat still smelling faintly of tobacco, already divided, already stripped of their meaning. I touched the coat, pressed my face into it, and for a moment the scent carried me back to evenings on the porch, his voice steady and low. Then Mark's voice shattered the memory. "Don't get sentimental, Sarah. These things take up space." Something inside me tightened. Neighbors came by with pies and sympathy, and even they noticed the shift. Mark answered the door with a host's grin. Linda lingered with her clipboard, and I was reduced to the background, a shadow in my own home. Their kindness toward me grew shorter, clipped, as though I were overstaying my welcome. One evening, as the snow pressed against the windows, I overheard Mark on the phone. His words were hushed but urgent. "Yes, we'll have it listed by spring. The market's hot. Don't worry, it'll go through." Listed, my father's house, my home, already spoken of as a commodity, a transaction. I wanted to storm into the room, to rip the phone from his hand, but instead I froze in the hallway, the plaster cold against my back. My breath shook, but my silence held, because I understood something then. They believed the battle was already won. They mistook my quiet for surrender. And perhaps that was my one advantage. For in that silence, I began to see more clearly. Their greed was no longer hidden. It strutted in daylight. Their contempt no longer whispered. It rang in every word. And beneath their footsteps on these wooden floors, I heard not the creak of old timber, but the drumbeat of a storm that had only begun to gather. The house had grown hostile, each hallway echoing with my brother's ambition and Linda's clipped commands. I moved like a guest in the very rooms I had once polished, a trespasser in the home where I had nursed my father through his last winter. The silence I carried was beginning to crack inside me, splintering into doubt. Was I truly as powerless as they wanted me to believe? It was then that Megan came. She was not family by blood, but by something sturdier. Years of friendship, forged in the plain fire of shared struggle. We had met in college, both working late shifts at the diner, both knowing the weight of bills that never rested. Now she stood in my father's kitchen, her coat dusted with snow, her eyes steady on mine. "I can't stay long," she said, her voice low so Mark and Linda wouldn't hear. "But I had to see you." The moment her hand closed over mine, the dam inside me gave way. I told her everything. The will read at the funeral, the boxes stacked like gravestones in the hallway, the whispers of selling the house as though my father's promise had never been spoken. My words tumbled out with shame and fury, but she did not flinch. "They're counting on your silence," Megan said, her voice calm but fierce. "But I know you, Sarah. You're not weak, you're patient. There's a difference." Her words struck deep. Patient. Yes, that was what my father had been. Enduring storms, carrying burdens in silence until the moment called for action. Maybe that blood still ran in me. Megan reached into her bag and pressed something into my hand. A business card. "A lawyer I know. A good one, just in case. You don't have to fight alone." I looked at the card, the black letters stark against the white. It felt heavier than paper, heavier even than the watch I still carried. It felt like a key slipped quietly into my palm. As she left, her footsteps fading into the snow outside, the house seemed a little less suffocating. For the first time since the ZE funeral, I felt a flicker of warmth that wasn't from memory, but from possibility. And in that moment, I understood. Allies don't always come from where you expect. Sometimes they step through the door when you're at your lowest, carrying nothing but their presence. And somehow, It's enough to keep you standing. The next evening, the kitchen was crowded with the smell of strong coffee and the scratch of Linda's pen across her ledger. Mark sat at the table, his sleeves rolled up, his voice full of certainty as he listed necessary expenses, contractors, realtors, even a new car, justified as business needs. Each word landed like a nail, hammered deeper into the coffin of my father's promise. I stood in the doorway, the lawyer's card from Megan heavy in my pocket. My throat tightened, but I spoke anyway. "There's one bill left unpaid," I said quietly. "The hospital sent notice. Father's last treatments. I've been covering what I can, but it's more than I can manage alone." I thought, maybe the estate could cover it? The pen in Linda's hand stilled. Mark leaned back in his chair, laughter flickering at the edges of his mouth. "You're asking us for money?" he said, as if the idea itself were comic. "It's not for me," I replied. "It's for him, for what he owed." Linda's eyes narrowed, cold as winter glass. "The estate will be managed properly, Sarah. You wouldn't understand. And frankly, this guilt-stricken generosity of yours doesn't change the will." Her words stung, but it was Mark's smirk that split me open. He pushed back from the table, stood, and clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, as though consoling me. "You've always been sentimental," he said. "That's why Dad trusted me with the real responsibilities. You took care of him when he was sick, sure. But this is business. You wouldn't survive a week making the kind of decisions we have to make." The words echoed in the room, sharper than the ticking of the kitchen clock. I felt my face heat, shame prickling my skin. They weren't just dismissing me, they were rewriting me, reducing every hour at my father's bedside, every sacrifice, into something small, feminine, inconsequential. For a moment I almost broke. I almost begged, almost pleaded for them to remember who I was to him, what I had done. But something stronger rose up, a silence that did not bow. I looked at the ledger, at the neat lines of ink where my father's life had been reduced to assets and debts. I saw in their eyes not family, but predators convinced their prey had no teeth. And though my lips pressed shut, though I turned away with the appearance of submission, inside me something shifted. Their cruelty was not just a wound, it was a measure. A line they had crossed so boldly that I could no longer pretend. The watch in my pocket ticked once, a faint sound against the roar of my blood. It was not the sound of time, passing. It was the sound of patience hardening into resolve. As I left the kitchen, their laughter followed me down the hall, light and careless, the sound of victors celebrating. But I knew what they could not. This was not my breaking. This was my awakening. Winter deepened. The snow outside pressed against the windows, heavy, silent, as if even the world conspired to bury me in quiet. I lived in my father's house like a ghost, moving from room to room with the care of someone trespassing in a place once her own. Each corner still carried his voice, but it was growing faint beneath the sound of Mark's boots and Linda's sharp instructions. One evening, I came home from the schoolhouse to find the living room stripped bare. The shelves where my father's books once stood, his worn Bible, his Navy manuals, the novels he loved but never finished, were empty. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway, taped and labeled in Linda's neat script. "Auction. Donation. Trash." Mark stood over a stack of framed photographs, prying the backs open, sliding out the pictures, tossing them carelessly aside. My father as a young man in uniform, my parents on their wedding day, even me as a child perched on his shoulders, all of it scattered on the floor like discarded receipts. "What are you doing?" My voice cracked. Mark glanced up, unfazed. "We need to make the place market ready. Buyers don't want clutter." "Clutter?" I bent to pick up the photo of my father in his uniform. The glass was cracked, the image smeared with dust. These are his life, our life. Linda appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. "Sarah, you need to stop interfering. The house will be listed in 2 weeks. We've already spoken to the realtor. Mark and I are handling it." My knees went weak. The realtor. It was no longer whispered, no longer hidden behind doors. They were selling the house. My house, the one my father had sworn would always be mine, before the ground at his grave had settled. You can't, I whispered. He promised. Linda cut me off. He promised a lot of things. What matters is what he put on paper, and the paper is clear. I turned to Mark, searching his face for some trace of the brother I had once loved, the boy who used to sneak me candy under the dinner table, who had carried me home on his back when I scraped my knees. But his eyes were cold, calculating. It's business, Sarah. Don't make it harder than it has to be. I felt the walls closing in. I clutched the photo frame against my chest, as if wood and glass could shield me from their betrayal. My breath came short, ragged. For a moment, I thought I might collapse right there on the living room floor, among the ruins of my father's life. But then something shifted. The weight of grief gave way to a deeper, sharper pain. Betrayal so complete, it left no room for denial. This was the bottom, the point where sorrow ended and rage began. I stood straighter, though my hands trembled. You may think I'm powerless, I said quietly, but this house is not just walls. It is my father's word, and his word is stronger than your greed. They laughed, softly, cruelly, as if I were a child, insisting the sun could rise at night. Their laughter followed me down the hall, echoing off the bare walls, and in that sound, I heard the truth. To them, I was already gone, already erased. That night, I sat alone in my father's empty study, the cold biting through the thin curtains. The lawyer's card lay on the desk, untouched. My father's watch ticked faintly in my pocket, and I knew this was not the end of my story. This was the beginning of the fight. For when you have lost everything, when even your own blood has taken the last of your shelter, there is nothing left to fear, only the resolve to rise. The morning after, the house was still stripped bare, the walls echoing with a silence that felt more cruel than any insult. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my father's watch ticking faintly in my hand, when a knock came at the door. It was Mr. Harris, our old neighbor. His coat was patched, his hands worn with years of labor at the mill, but his eyes carried something steady. He removed his cap, shifted uncomfortably, and said, "Sarah, I shouldn't intrude, but I heard talk about the will." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. He sat across from me, his rough hands folded. "Your father spoke to me last fall, out there, on the porch. He said plain as day, 'When I'm gone, this house will be Sarah's. She's the one who kept it alive.'" Harris's voice trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of carrying another man's promise. The words cut through me, both comfort and knife. Comfort, because I was not mad. My father had said it, to someone other than me. Knife, because now I knew for certain. The will Linda read at the funeral was not his truth, but their invention. Mark entered just then, his face darkening as he saw Harris at the table. "This is family business," he snapped. "No need for outsiders." But Harris did not flinch. He rose slowly, meeting Mark's glare with quiet resolve. "Sometimes it takes an outsider to tell the truth you'd rather bury." Then he turned back to me. "Don't let them silence you, Sarah. Your father's word was clear." When he left, the kitchen felt less empty. For the first time, my grief was not alone. There was a witness, a voice beyond mine, carrying my father's promise like a torch against their darkness. And in that flicker of light, I felt the first true crack in their wall of lies. That night, the house felt heavier than ever, as though each beam groaned under the weight of secrets. I wandered its hollow rooms with a candle, the light trembling against stripped walls. Mr. Harris's words echoed inside me. "Your father said the house would be yours." His voice had steadied me, but it was not enough. Words could be twisted, dismissed as memory. I needed proof. I found myself in the garage, the cold biting through my coat. In the corner stood my father's old navy trunk, rust creeping along its hinges. I had seen it all my life, but never opened it. He guarded it like a soldier guards his last weapon. That night, desperation gave me courage. The lock was already weak. One pull and it gave way. Inside lay a lifetime, Metals dulled by time, letters with creased edges, photographs of faces long gone. Each item smelled of dust and salt, the remnants of a man who had lived half on land, half at sea. At the very bottom, beneath a folded flag, I found it, an envelope, sealed, my name written across it in his hand. The writing was firm, deliberate, though the last letters wavered with sickness. My breath caught. I pressed the envelope to my chest, trembling. The candle's flames sputtered, throwing wild shadows across the walls. In that instant, I knew. This was no scrap of memory, no neighbor's testimony. This was his voice, reaching for me from beyond the grave. I did not open it then. I could not. For just holding it, sealed and silent, was enough to feel the weight of a truth my family had tried to bury. And as I stood in the dark garage, clutching that envelope, I understood that tomorrow would no longer be about grief. Tomorrow would be about war, rattling the windows like restless bones. My hands shook as I tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter, written in my father's strong but wavering hand. "Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I need you to know what I could not say in front of them. The house is yours. I built it for your mother. I kept it for you. Mark will chase money until it ruins him, and Linda will feed that hunger. Do not let them have these walls. They belong to you, the daughter who stayed, who carried me when I could no longer stand. Do not doubt your worth. Do not surrender." The words blurred as my tears fell, staining the paper. It was not just a promise. It was testimony, a witness stronger than their counterfeit will. My father had left me not money, not jewels, but the truth. I pressed the letter flat on the desk, smoothing each line as if to anchor it into the wood itself. A weight lifted from me, not grief, not entirely, but something harder, sharper. For weeks I had been moving in the silence, swallowing their scorn, fearing their laughter. But now, in my hand, I held the one thing they could not erase, his voice, immortal on the page. The watch ticked faintly in my pocket, as if echoing his command. I rose from the chair, the morning light cutting through the curtains. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the ground beneath me solid, unshifting. They thought they had buried me under paper and signatures. But my father had left me a hammer, and with it, I would break the coffin wide open. I waited until evening. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing the street in white silence. Inside, the house glowed with lamplight, but the warmth was false, brittle, like a stage set. Mark sat in Father's chair, legs sprawled, swirling whiskey in a glass he hadn't earned. Linda perched beside him, ledger open, her pen scratching figures across the page as though she were dividing spoils after a war. I entered the room with the envelope in my hand. The sound of the paper alone seemed to shift the air. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was steady, but inside, every nerve burned. Mark glanced up, smirking. "What now, Sarah? More tears? More complaints about sentiment?" I stepped closer, placed the letter on the table between us. "Not complaints. Evidence." Linda's pen froze. Mark leaned forward, frown creasing his brow as he recognized Father's handwriting. "This is his," I continued. "His words, not the ones you read in church. He left this house to me, not you, not your balance sheets or your buyers. Me." Mark snatched the letter, scanning the lines, his face tightening. Linda tried to keep her composure, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the fear of a fortress breached. "This means nothing," she said sharply. "A letter isn't a legal document. The will is binding." I met her gaze, unflinching. "A forged will is nothing but ink and lies, and you know it." Silence fell, heavy, unrelenting. Even the clock on the mantel seemed to pause. Mark slammed the letter down. "You think you can fight us? You think a judge will take your side? You're weak, Sarah. Always have been. That's why Dad left me in charge." Something inside me snapped, but not into anger, into clarity. I stood straighter, my voice cutting through his like glass. "Number, he left me the house because I stayed, because I fed him when he couldn't lift a spoon, because I held his hand when he couldn't breathe through the night. While you were out losing money and calling it business, I was here, He saw me, and now I see you." Mark's face reddened. Linda rose, her ledger clutched like a shield. "Careful, Sarah. Words have consequences." "So does silence," I replied. For weeks I had swallowed their scorn, bowed under their laughter. But tonight the bow broke. I reached for the watch in my pocket, held it high enough for them to see. Its tick filled the room, faint but defiant. "This house is not for sale. Not now, not ever. And if you try to strip it from me, I'll take this letter, this watch, and the truth of who he was. To court, to the world, to anyone who will listen. And you'll be the one standing in shame." Their silence was answer enough. The stage had shifted. For the first time since Father's death, I was not the quiet daughter in the corner. I was his heir. The room did not return to silence after my words. It cracked open. Mark turned on Linda first. "You said the will was airtight. You promised me this wouldn't happen." His voice shook, not with grief, but with panic, the kind a gambler feels when the cards slip from his hand. Linda's face hardened, but her calm veneer faltered. "Don't blame me. I warned you Sarah was stubborn. You underestimated her." I stood between them, letter in hand, watching as their alliance began to crumble under the weight of truth. For weeks they had spoken with one voice, plotting in corners, certain of their control. But now the cracks ran deep, splitting them apart. Mark jabbed a finger toward her. "You pushed me into this, into the realtor, into the lies. And you were happy to sign your name to all of it," Linda shot back. "Don't pretend you're a victim." Their words lashed at each other, sharp and frantic, until the house itself seemed to tremble. I almost stepped back, not from fear, but from the sheer ugliness of it. Two people who had called themselves my family, now tearing at each other like scavengers, who realized the carcass was smaller than they thought. For the first time since the funeral, I was no longer the target. Their fury turned inward, revealing what had always been true. There was no love binding them, only greed. And greed does not hold when the ground shifts. Mark slammed his glass down, amber liquid spilling across the table. Linda clutched her ledger as if it might shield her. They looked at me then, both of them, but no longer united, two wolves circling, wary even of each other. In that moment, the family I had known all my life, the fragile thread, frayed but still holding, snapped. Whatever mask of unity remained was gone. What lingered in its place was not family at all, only strangers bound by blood and betrayal, standing in the ruins of a name my father had once carried with pride. And I knew. This was no longer just about saving a house. It was about surviving the collapse of everything that had once been called family. The courthouse smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of place where lives are weighed not in years, but in signatures. I sat at the long oak table, my father's letter folded neatly before me, the watch beside it ticking faintly like a second witness. Across from me, Mark shifted in his chair, his suit too new, his confidence already fraying. Linda clutched her folder of documents as if the weight of paper alone could bend truth. The judge entered, gray-haired and solemn, his gavel striking once. The sound echoed like thunder in the hollow chamber. "Case of Wilson Estate," the clerk intoned. Mark's lawyer rose first, words sharp, polished. The will was clear, the estate rightfully his. He spoke of law, of binding signatures, of order. But his voice rang hollow, like a salesman hawking wares too bright to be real. When my turn came, I stood. My knees trembled, but my voice did not. "Your Honor," I said, "my father was not a man of wealth. He left behind no empire, no fortune, only a house. But that house is more than boards and stone. It is his word." I placed the letter on the stand. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading slowly. Each line hung in the room, heavy, unflinching. "The house is yours. Do not doubt your worth. Do not surrender." For a moment, silence. Then my lawyer spoke, his words plain. "This letter, dated and signed in the hand of Gregory Wilson, directly contradicts the contested will. We believe the will was tampered with, filed under undue influence." Linda rose sharply, protesting, her voice shrill. But the judge raised a hand. Sit down. Mark slumped lower in his chair, the fight draining from his face as though he already heard the verdict. He would not meet my eyes. The judge set the letter down with care, as though it were fragile glass. Then he spoke. The court finds sufficient grounds to invalidate the presented will. The property of Gregory Wilson shall remain with his daughter, Sarah Wilson. The gavel fell. It was not thunder this time, it was deliverance. I did not cheer, I did not smile, I only breathed, a breath that felt like the first in months. Mark muttered something under his breath. Linda hissed about appeals and technicalities. But their voices were dim now, fading into the corners like shadows at sunrise. The law had spoken, and for once, truth had not been buried under ink and signatures. As I gathered the letter and the watch, I felt my father's presence, not as a ghost, but as a witness who had stood beside me, even in death. His promise had not been lost. It had carried me here, to this moment, where silence gave way to justice. Outside, the snow had melted into slush. The sky was gray but open. And for the first time since the funeral, the ground beneath my feet felt like it belonged to me. The gavel had fallen, the courthouse emptied, and yet I carried the echo of that judgment inside me for days. The property shall remain with his daughter. Words carved into me deeper than any wound, because they were not just about land or walls, but about being seen, finally, as my father had seen me. Back at the house, the room still bore scars of what had been done. Shelves stripped bare, boxes marked auction, the photographs tossed carelessly on the floor. It was not victory I felt when I stepped inside, but exhaustion. The house was mine again, yes, but it was broken, much like me. So I began the slow work of rebuilding. Each morning I rose before the sun, made coffee the way my father had, strong enough to scald, poured into the chipped mug he favored. I moved through the rooms not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker, reclaiming wounded ground. I unpacked the boxes, cleaned the dust from his medals, rehung the photographs. Every nail I hammered into the wall was not just for a frame. It was for memory, for dignity, for the truth they had tried to erase. Neighbors began to notice the change. Mrs. Kent from across the street brought over bread one morning. Mr. Harris stopped by to fix the sagging fence. They did not ask about the trial. They simply treated me as one who had endured. Their quiet kindness reminded me that family is not always bound by blood, but by those who choose to stand beside you when others turn away. Megan came often, her laughter spilling into the halls like fresh paint. One evening, as we scrubbed the walls clean of smoke stains left by years of my father's pipes, she said, "It feels like the house is breathing again." And I realized she was right. The silence was no longer hostile. It was peaceful, the kind of silence you find after a storm has passed. But rebuilding was not only about the house, it was about myself. For years, I had been the quiet daughter, the overlooked one, the figure in the background of my own family's story. They had written me small, diminished me until I believed it myself. The courtroom had given me back the house, but in truth, it had given me back my voice. I applied for a position at the local community center, helping families navigate care for their elderly parents. It was work born from my own journey, nights at my father's bedside, days managing his medications and meals. What had once been overlooked as women's work now became my calling. I spoke at town meetings about resources for caregivers, and for the first time, people listened. And in the quiet of my evenings, I began to write. Not grand stories, just fragments. Memories of my father's words, of the way the house sounded in winter, of the moments that had nearly broken me, but instead became proof of my endurance. The pages filled slowly, but each word was a brick in the new foundation of who I was becoming. Sometimes, walking through the halls at night, I still heard their laughter, Mark's careless confidence, Linda's sharp dismissals. But they were only echoes now, stripped of power. The walls no longer belonged to them. They belonged to me, and to the memory of the man who had trusted me with them. Rebuilding was not a triumph shouted from rooftops. It was quieter, steadier, like stitching a torn garment back together. But it was mine, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. As spring thawed the last of the snow, the garden began to stir. I planted flowers by the porch, not because my father had, but because I wanted to. Their roots sank deep into the soil, anchoring me in a way nothing else could. And as the first blossoms opened, I understood. Survival was not the end of my story. Renewal was. Summer had settled in, and the house smelled of new paint and warm bread. For the first time in years, it was alive again. The garden bloomed, neighbors waved, and the silence that once strangled now carried peace. I thought the past had loosened its grip, until one afternoon, I saw Mark's car at the curb. He stood on the porch like a man rehearsing humility. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft, too soft. "I came to make amends." Behind him, Linda appeared. No ledger this time. Just a smile, strained thin, the kind people wear when they want something. "We were wrong," she said quickly. "We acted out of grief. We'd like a chance to set things right." I let them in. Not out of kindness, but curiosity. They walked through the room slowly, eyes tracing the photographs I had rehung, the fresh curtains Megan helped me sew. The house no longer looked like theirs. It never had. At the table, Mark folded his hands, rehearsed penitence breaking through into desperation. "We're family. We should share this place. Maybe sell a piece of the land. Split the profit fairly this time." His words hung in the air, heavy with the same greed that had driven him before. Linda added, "We don't want to fight anymore. We just want to belong." I studied them, my father's watch ticking in my pocket, the letter locked safely upstairs, and I saw them clearly, not as villains, not as kin, but as broken people still chained to hunger. "You left this house the moment you chose yourselves over him," I said quietly. "You don't return to family by knocking at a door. You return by carrying its weight when it's hardest, and you never did." Mark's face fell, the mask slipping. Linda's eyes hardened, realizing the door was not just closed. It was gone. They left without another word, their footsteps fading down the path. The garden swayed in the summer wind, blossoms bending but not breaking. And I knew. The family that had betrayed me could not return. What remained was the one I was building, brick by brick, truth by truth. The house is quiet now. The garden hums with summer insects. The walls breathe in the evening air. And for the first time in years, the silence is not a weapon. It is a companion. I walk these halls, and I think of how close I came to losing them. Not just the rooms, not just the roof, but the promise that lived within them. They tried to strip it away, to reduce a life to a line on a ledger, to measure love in profit and inheritance. And for a time, I almost let them. I almost believed that silence was safety, that endurance meant surrender. But the truth is simpler, heavier. Endurance is not surrender. It is the gathering of strength until the moment comes to speak. And when I finally spoke, when I placed his letter on the table, I understood. My father had not left me a house. He had left me a voice. Mark and Linda came back, of course. They always do, people like that. They think time erases wounds, that hunger can be disguised as remorse. But when they walked through those doors, I saw them for what they were. Wanderers looking for shelter in a place they themselves had burned. Family is not blood alone. Family is who stands beside you when the night is long. And they never did. This house will stand, not because of courts or papers, but because it is built on something stronger. Memory, labor, sacrifice. My father's hands are in every nail, my own tears, in every floorboard. To sell it would have been to sell him, to sell myself. That is what they never understood. Some things are not for sale, not at any price. I do not hate them. Hatred is another chain, and I have carried enough. I only know this: they cannot return. The door is closed, not with locks or bolts, but with truth. And truth does not reopen itself. So I live here, in a house remade, not grand, not wealthy, but whole. I plant flowers by the porch. I welcome neighbors in for bread. I write my father's words on clean pages so they will not be forgotten. And when I hear the watch tick in my pocket, I do not hear time slipping away. I hear his voice steady as ever. Do not surrender. That is what I carry forward. Not bitterness, not loss, but the knowledge that dignity is won in the quiet moments, when you choose to stand, even if your voice trembles. And if anyone asks me what I inherited, I will not say a house. I will say this. I inherited the strength to claim my place in a family, even if I had to build that family anew. The lights dim, the garden sleeps, and the house stands. That is enough.